Hey everybody, Amy Williams here from Skellig, and after taking some time to reflect, I want to share my overall thoughts on the first ever ProveIt conference and talk about why it worked, what made it different, and what vendors should be thinking about for ProveIt 2026. So, as everybody agrees, this event was an overwhelming success. And that was only possible because of two things. First and foremost, the incredible turnout from you guys in the community. And second, the massive effort behind the scenes that made it all happen. For those who don't know, I had the privilege of being one of the MCs for ProveIt, while Skellig also participated as a vendor. So that gives me a unique perspective, not just on the event itself, but on the 16 weeks leading up to it and everything it took to pull it off. And let me tell you, the 4.0 Solutions team and Zach, Josh, Vaughn, Walker, they were full throttle from day one. I honestly don't know when they slept, and I hope they're finally getting some well-earned time off now. Now, if you're wondering why no one has ever attempted something like this before, it's because it's insanely difficult. This wasn't just another conference. It was a technical stress test at every level. The team had to build the entire infrastructure, manage access, load balance brokers and databases, and on top of all that, ensure uptime for the entire 3-day event. It's not like they just called up the client's IT department and said, "Hey, can I have 36 remote users with read-only access?" No, it wasn't that simple. Vendors were not just handed a read-only login to the client's MQTT broker and servers. While it was a huge donation for the client to share their namespace, there was still intellectual property that had to be protected. So that meant on the back end, the ProveIt team had to scrub sensitive data, build simulators to replace proprietary information, and capture and share select real-time live data. Basically, this was a conference that only technical experts could put together. And if that wasn't enough, Walker actively threw in some monkey wrenches to actually trip up the vendors, which made this truly a 16-week challenge, and what made ProveIt so much more than just another conference. And that's how they got it off the ground. Now, when it came to the actual conference, let me tell you, there were two key players who made it all possible, and that was Tanya Reynolds and Mark Pearson. Without them, it wouldn't have gone half as well, and you're not going to convince me otherwise. So, unsurprisingly, during the event, we did have some last-minute schedule changes, media adjustments, and honestly, a lot of moving parts happening. And thanks to Tanya and Mark's leadership and their teams, everything ran smoothly. And my reoccurring thought throughout the conference was, if I can get my request to Tanya or Mark, I know it's handled. And there are very few people who I can say that about. So throwing this out there, if I were to pick the team for ProveIt 2026, I'd want them on it. And speaking of team, I also want to say how glad I am that Jeff Winter was chosen as the other MC. Honestly, this was my first time in that role, so thank you, Walker, for the opportunity. And being paired with someone who is more experienced was a wonderful learning moment. Now, most people know Jeff as like the big name in Industry 4 and on LinkedIn. You know, he's a thought leader, a strategist, has great stage presence, and is always ready with a mix of, good and bad dad jokes. But what stood out to me was how intentional he is behind the scenes. He does not just wing it. Every conversation we had showed how carefully he considers his message, making sure anything he says aligns with the goals and focuses on highlighting any unique value that he can bring. And I have to give him credit. He actually came up with the question, explain the next best solution and why yours is better. So thank you, Jeff, for your work. I really hope we get an opportunity to collaborate again in the future. All right, so that covered how the conference was successfully executed, but why put in all of this effort? Well, What made ProveIt special was it gave the end users an experience they never had before. The chance to see Industry 4 solutions put to the test in a real-world environment. And the novel aspect of this conference was the end users had 3 dimensions that they could evaluate vendors: technical, execution, and communication. Because honestly, you do need all 3 in order to be successful in your digital transformation. So on the technical front, they were evaluating, does the solution perform the functionality they claimed? In this case, seeing is believing. Now honestly, you could get this at other conferences. The difference at ProveIt was the live demo was mandatory for every vendor there. And they all had to connect to one common infrastructure, in this case an MQTT-based unified namespace. But you know what you really can't get at any other conference? The second criteria, which was execution. Can the vendor actually deliver in 16 weeks? Because it is one thing to have a solution that works in a controlled, simulated environment. But it's a whole nother challenge to navigate real-world, unexpected obstacles on a tight timeline. And as someone who was on the vendor side, I can tell you, they did not make it easy. And having them present the exact numbers for time, cost, and show what was actually delivered demonstrated who actually knows how to work and succeed with the end users. And the third thing that they could evaluate on was messaging. Do the vendors actually know their audience? As long as the presenters answered the 4 questions, what's the problem, how'd you do it, how long, and cost, they otherwise had full control of their session. And the freedom that they were given really highlighted who did their research, who truly understands the community, and knows what the end users want to see and what the end users want to hear during those 45 minutes. And my favorite part about this setup was how it elevated conversations around each session. It wasn't as simple as, did they do it or not? We had a lot of nuanced discussions about what people saw. So instead of just evaluating technical success, attendees were debating things like, yeah, they answered the questions, but did they connect with the end users? Or, I was already familiar with their platform, they didn't have any new features, but wow, their presentation completely changed how I saw its value. And yes, Mark, I'm talking about you. Now, my one piece of advice for vendors who want to stand out in ProveIt 2026. Understand the audience, specifically these 2 things. Number 1, ProveIt intentionally sells tickets to have a higher ratio of end users to vendors. Traditional conferences are usually vendor heavy, meaning like sales pitches, marketing, business networking kind of take center stage. But end users don't want that. End users have to live with these solutions, so they care about technical details, real-world execution, and practical value. And I have to say, this is something that ProveIt nailed this year with the technical challenges. Everyone who showed up knew their stuff, which is why so many people I talked to called it the best conference of the year and said they're coming back. And this brings me to the second thing you need to remember about the audience. A lot of them are going to be repeat attendees. This year, over 680 people in total participated. So even if ProveIt 2026 scales up to over 1,000, it's safe to assume that over 50% will be repeat attendees. That means many people in your audience will have already seen the solutions showcased this year. So keeping it fresh will be a challenge. One thing that you can do is announce or showcase your new features at this conference. Because remember, this isn't just any audience. This conference attracts the biggest names in Industry 4. I mean, this year, we of course had Walker Reynolds, Zach Scriven, Jeff Winter, Dave and Vlad with Manufacturing Hub, Automation Ladies, and more. If you impress here, the word will get out. The people at this conference are the ones who test, implement, and talk about these solutions publicly. Even today, I had clients talking about HiveMQ Pulse, and that was just announced last week at ProveIt. But you might be asking, well, what if my product isn't changing? Now, honestly, if your solution remains exactly the same between now and ProveIt 2026, I think that's a red flag. Digital transformation is a continuous process, so if you're keeping up with the industry needs, you should always be adding new features, new improvements to better serve them. However, let's say for the sake of argument, your product won't change. In that case, focus on the other two dimensions, execution and communication. Execute well on the 16-week challenge and tailor your messaging to the new industry focus. Because the next year is life sciences, and that is an entirely different world from flexible packaging. So even if you're using the exact same toolkit, I'm going to expect to see you solving different problems with it. Speaking of, since ProveIt 2026 is going to include life sciences, there are a few things to consider that I honestly would love to hear your input on. One thing that makes life sciences unique is the ridiculously tight regulations. If you want life sciences customers to get really excited about your solution, they will want to know how it can be deployed in a regulated environment. But here's the problem. That is about as dry and boring of a topic as you can get. Nobody in energy or discrete automation wants to sit through a deep dive on 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. And I don't blame them. So how do we make sure that ProveIt isn't isolating or irrelevant to the attendees from the other industry? One suggestion I have is to make the virtual factory have two distinct sections. A full GMP, which stands for Good Manufacturing Practices, train for vendors who want to showcase compliance capabilities. But then also have a non-GMP space, like a lab area, for vendors that don't need to tackle regulatory compliance, but still want to prove their technical capability. And a bonus idea, the lab space could even have emulators for protocols like RS-232 or Modbus. It could be cool to see how vendors handle legacy connectivity and data modeling. Now, if the ProveIt conference did decide to include talks about compliance, another idea could be to have that be clearly indicated in the presentations. Because for life science attendees, that is high value content. But for attendees from other industries, they probably want to skip that part. So one option is to dedicate the compliance discussion maybe to the end of the session, so those who are uninterested can opt out without missing on the other valuable technical presentation. Because I will be honest, most of what people come to Skellig for is to talk about validation and compliance. It does take time, it is value add, but really only if you're in the life sciences. Now, the last suggestion I have would be to slightly tweak the functional specification to include two things: date approved and version number. Because the thing is, life science companies are brutal when it comes to documentation, and they have no chill. Let's say hypothetically, your functional spec got approved and it had a critical mistake. It said delete system 32. If you went on site and did not delete system 32, engineering would be relieved, but the FDA would not. Unless you have a properly redlined functional spec with full change control and approvals, you're still in violation, even if you technically did the right thing. So this is the level of traceability and accountability that the life science companies are going to expect. So what would enhance the presentations for this vertical is to have the vendors maybe flash a QR code with their FS before they begin. This way, the audience can see when did they actually finalize their functional spec, and two, they can track if the vendor adhered to it or had to pivot to a newer version. Because honestly, sometimes things change. And that opens up an important discussion about how they handle that change over the 16 weeks. So it adds transparency and highlights how the vendors navigate real-world implementation challenges, which I think is just as valuable as the technical execution itself. So these are just a few of my thoughts, but I would love to hear from you. If you are in life sciences, what do you want to see at ProveIt 2026? And if you're not in life sciences, what would make this conference still valuable to you? Definitely leave your thoughts in the comments. I really want to read them. And thank you guys so much for your help. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.